Hey Fisher friends, in today's video we're going to tear down and clean a Revo SX reel from Abu Garcia. Stick around. Hey folks, Keith here at Chicken Thigh Fishing. Welcome aboard. Today we're going to tear down a Revo SX low profile bait casting reel. We're going to disassemble, clean, lubricate, reassemble it. As in all my cleaning videos, I'd just like to point out a couple of tips to you before we get going. As much as you're able to, you should always have a schematic of your reel available so you can refer to it if you need to. If you don't have a manual that came in the box that you bought the reel with, you can always go to the manufacturer's website and pretty much always can print one out for your reel so you have one on hand. I also recommend having your phone handy so you can take a couple of photos of your process so you don't forget anything. I'll show you the key points where to take photos. And also, I would always advise to work on a movable surface. Cleaning a reel can take an hour or more. And if you're somebody who may get called away from it in the middle of it, you don't want to have your reel disassembled on your dining room table, for instance, and have to leave and have pets or kids get at it and mess up the components that you have. So I would always do it on a movable working surface, and if you have to leave in the middle of it, you throw it on top of a refrigerator or a cabinet or down in the basement somewhere. I use a cookie sheet, works terrifically for me. Let's get going on this SX reel. First thing we're going to do is remove that palm side plate. And on the Revo SX, the release mechanism is a lever on the bottom here. Simply click that and you can remove the palm side plate. Of course, once you remove the palm side plate, it gives you access to the spool and you can remove your spool. Now that we have the palm side taken care of, we're going to move to the handle side. We're going to remove the handle assembly, the star drag, and the handle side plate. So the first thing we're going to do is take out the screw that holds the nut retainer in place. Once that screw is out, the nut retainer should just fall from gravity. If it doesn't, and if it's stuck there due to oil or grime or anything else, all you need to do is take a small screwdriver, a small slotted screwdriver, and just pop it off. It comes off easy enough. Next, we're going to remove the handle nut so we can remove the handle. Just a word of caution: if you are a lefty like me and your handle is on the left hand side of your reel, it is not righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. It is the opposite. If you go to take this off and turn it to the left, thinking you're loosening it, you're going to tighten it, and if you over-tight it, it's very easy to strip that. You're going to use a 10mm wrench or a small adjustable wrench, whatever you have, and we're going to crack this to the right to loosen it on a left-handed reel. Once we crack it, we can go ahead and remove it the rest of the way by hand. Comes off fairly easy enough. And we're going to remove the handle. A lot of times when you remove the handle on a bait casting reel, stuck to the back of it will be the first washer, the handle washer. In this case, it didn't stick to it. It's right here, but if you take off the handle and you don't see a washer right there, any one of a number of different kinds, but there's always a washer right there. If you don't see it there, it's going to be stuck to your handle and you just remove it. In this case, it did not stick to the handle, so I'm going to remove it from the gear shaft and place it down. After the handle, we're going to remove the star drag, and removing the star drag is as simple as unscrewing it. So I just spun the star drag off, and with it came the next washer, which is a pressure washer. And underneath the first washer, you're usually going to have two curved washers. And I'm going to be careful about taking those out because they are curved and we want to keep them in the same orientation for when we reassemble, because they're curved in a certain way. It's not dramatic, it's kind of hard to detect unless you hold it right up, but you can see that they're curved. So I'm going to keep them in the same position, and when I pick them up and clean them later, I'm going to make sure I keep them in the same position so when it comes time to reassemble, I put them back on in the same position. Now this reel has a click washer with a click spring in it, and those washers fit inside this click washer. Not all reels have that, but this one does. Now next you're going to have the sleeve. There's a sleeve washer that goes over the gear shaft. Sometimes it will fall out. And just by tipping it upside down, I got it to come out a little bit. And usually it has either one or two washers on top. Sometimes it won't have any. So I'm going to remove that sleeve, and this does not have a removable washer on top. One thing of note with the sleeve, it looks like it has two round openings, one on each end, but not quite. One opening is completely circular. The other opening has two straight sides, and the shape is very similar to this on the handle washer. You want to take note that the side with the two straight sides is the side that goes up or out of the reel. So you want to make sure you're aware of that when you put this down and when you pick it up later and clean it, so when you put it back on, you put it back on in the correct position. If you're unable to get that out because it's stuck, because your reel is so dirty or there's some kind of foreign object in there, that's no big deal. Once you remove the handle side plate, you're able to easily remove it. So if you can't remove it at this stage, you can remove it after we remove the handle side plate, which is what we're going to do now. And what we do to remove the handle side plate is remove the screws. Unlike the palm side plate, which is held in by a click lever mechanism, the handle side plate is secured by screws. It's usually secured by screws on the outside and on the inside. Now on the SX reel, it looks like we have 1, 2, 3 screws on the exterior and 1, 2 screws on the back. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the exterior screws. Now a tip for you here is that I always lay out the screws in the same pattern that they go in the handle side plate. And the reason for that is, as you can see on the same reel, there are different size and lengths screws when it comes to disassembling your reel. So it makes it much easier for reassembly if you keep them in the same pattern, so you can look at them and know which hole they go in without trying to force the wrong screw into the wrong hole. So now that I have the 3 outside screws removed, I'm going to move to the inside screws. And well, it looks like there's only one on the inside. And the one on the inside is not only a screw to hold the body of the reel fastened to the handle side plate, but it is also to hold the lubrication port door. Some reels come equipped with a lubrication port door so that you can open that door and put grease in on your gear without dismantling the reel. One important thing to note is if you don't remove that door from that slot, once you remove that screw, it's difficult to remove the handle side plate. So you always want to remove that. And I am going to put the screw that goes to that right with it. And then I should be able to lift off the handle side plate. Now when I set the handle side plate off, you can see that the screws are in the pattern corresponding with the holes that they go in. Now that we have the handle side plate off, this is the first place I recommend that you take a photograph if you're not familiar with dismantling bait casting reels. That way you can get a good clear photograph of how things are oriented and what the proper positions are. So if you should mess something up along the way, you have a photo to refer to get it right during the reassembly. So now the first part that we're going to disassemble is the yoke and the pinion gear. The yoke has 2 springs on it, and we're going to remove the yoke springs from the yoke post. Once I do that, I am able to lift up on the pinion gear, and the pinion gear fits into the yoke like so. You'll notice that the pinion gear has a fat side and a skinnier side. The fat side always goes down, and the middle groove is where it sits in the yoke. So I'm going to take that dirty yoke there and put that there, and I am going to take the pinion gear and put that right there. Now on this reel, unlike most other reels that I own and that I clean, you may have noticed when I removed the spool that the spool didn't have a shaft on it. Most spools have a shaft on it that goes in through the housing and into the pinion gear. On this Revo SX, it has a pinion shaft. So it's separate from the spool where it usually is on. So when you remove the pinion gear on this particular reel, you're also going to remove the pinion shaft, and there's a little retainer on it, like so. Now that we have the yoke and the pinion gear removed, we're going to go ahead and remove the gear assembly, which consists of the main gear and the drag washer assembly. So I'm going to lift that off, and sometimes it requires a little bit of force, but you want to make sure that you do it under control so you don't send anything flying. And we're going to hold it all together like a sandwich because there'll be multiple parts in there. We don't want any to fall out of order. Now usually when you lift up a main gear, the drag washer and ratchet that are beneath them typically stick to it. So most of the time you will lift this up and these 2 components will be attached under here. They'll be stuck from the oil and the dirt in your reel, and you slide them out. In this case they didn't stick to it, so I'm going to go ahead and remove the ratchet and that drag washer, and then from the other end I'm going to keep them in the order that they go in. We're going to remove the drag washers, which consist of both metal, I believe these are aluminum washers, and carbon fiber washers. And you want to be careful with them because the carbon washers can be delicate sometimes, and you want to make sure that there are none stuck together so you have the correct order of all of the washers. So this drag washer and main gear assembly consists of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 parts. Different reels have different numbers of drag washers in them, and sometimes you can have significantly more or significantly less. So you always want to keep them in the order that they go back on to the main gear shaft. Now that we have the pinion gear and the yoke out, and we have the main gear and the drag washer assembly out, we are going to remove the main gear shaft and gear assembly and the bearing plate underneath it. Those are typically held in by 2 screws. So we will remove those screws. And underneath the lower gear and the bearing plate, there is typically a bearing, and that bearing will either be seated in a pocket or it will be physically attached to the bottom here, and we'll see. So the bearing here is attached to the shaft with an E-clip, and there's really no need to remove that. We can just clean and oil that as is. So I'm going to stick that over here with the 2 screws that go to that, and that's all we need to do for removal of parts on that side. So we have the palm side off, we have the handle side off. The next thing we're going to do is remove the level wind guide and worm gear assembly. The first thing we need to do in order to do that is to remove this hood or shroud, this front fascia piece, which is usually made out of thin plastic. It's usually held on by 1 screw on either side, and so we'll remove those screws and take the hood off. Now I'm going to be cognizant of which side which screw comes out of, because sometimes they are different sizes. And I always do that by looking at having the reel face me and looking at the face of it. So this came off the left side. I'm going to remove that hood, and I'm going to put that aside. And this screw came off that side, and this screw came off that side. And they look to be the same size screws, but oftentimes you will have slightly different sizes there, so you want to remember which one goes on which side. Now that we have the hood removed, we can go ahead and remove the pillars or the line guide rods. And on this reel there are 2 of them. Now when you remove these line guide rods, you want to keep them in the same orientation that you remove them, because they only go in one way. So when I reassemble this rod is going to go in this way, and there is a nub on one end and the other end doesn't have one. So it goes in, and this little nub on the end seats in the corresponding hole on the handle side of the reel. So I'm going to remove that one, and I'm going to remove that one, and keep them in the position in which I pick them up and reassemble them. Now that I have those 2 line guide rods removed, I can go ahead and remove the worm gear nut, which usually can be loosened by hand. If not, it has a slot for a slotted screwdriver. And when you remove the handle gear nut, there is usually a spacer in between the handle gear nut, the worm gear nut rather, and the pawl, which is inside there. And you can see that copper spacer is stuck to the pawl. Sometimes it gets stuck in the cap here. So I'm going to let gravity work and drop that pawl and spacer out into my hand. So we have the cap, the spacer, and the pawl. Now that we have that removed, the line guide is no longer engaged with the worm gear, so we can go ahead and remove the worm gear. Now, this is an important part where you may want to take a photograph of the handle side and of the palm side of the reel, so you remember which components go on which side when it comes time to reassemble. We are going to take apart the palm side first, because the palm side includes an E-clip which holds everything together, so you can't really take any of the rest of it apart until you disassemble this side, which has an E-clip on it. So in order to remove that E-clip, I'm going to take a small slotted screwdriver, and I'm going to stick the tip of it in one of the little holes, and I'm going to pop it off. But I want to say that you should always cup your hand over it when you do this, because when you remove that E-clip, it has a propensity for flying across the room. If it does go flying across the room, you're going to have a difficult time finding it. So once you get your screwdriver in position to pop that E-clip off, I strongly recommend covering it with your hand when you pop it off. So it bounced off my hand, and there it is. Underneath that E-clip, you will find usually 1 or 2. In this case, it looks like there's 1 spacer, and then a plastic bushing, and and that is the palm side of the worm gear. So now we're going to move over to the handle side of the worm gear, where you will find this gear, which is held in with a very small pin. And sometimes you can grab that pin with your hand. Other times, because it's slippery with oil or because you have pickle fingers like I do, it's a little difficult to remove, so you may need some tweezers. So you can see how small that pin is. That enables you to remove this plastic gear. Underneath that gear will be a bearing which you can pop out. Sometimes it won't come out until you pop it out with the worm gear itself. So the worm gear goes into the worm gear tube, and it only goes in one way, much like those rods. So you want to make sure that you're aware of its orientation when you remove it, so you can put it back in the same way. And an easy way to remember it is the handle side that has that gear on it. The handle side of the worm gear has a hole for that pin to fit through. So as long as you remember that, you'll put the worm gear back in the correct way. And then I'm going to line these components up in the same way that we're going to put them back. Now I'm going to remove the worm gear tube, and when I do that, I'm going to take the line guide off of it. And this is your line guide, and you'll see that it has the big hole for the worm gear tube to go through, and the smaller hole you see there is for the front pillar or line guide shaft. Once I have that off, I can pull out the worm gear tube, and the worm gear tube, like the other components, only goes in one way, and it goes in from the handle side to the palm side. One end of it has a lip, a ridged lip, and the other end does not. The ridged lip end goes on the gear side, the handle side, and it has that bearing in there that we're going to pop out so we can clean it, and also so we don't accidentally drop it out of the worm gear tube and not know that we did that. So just to review, we just removed the whole line guide and worm gear assembly, and we laid out the parts in the order in which they go back in, and the orientation, more importantly. The fastening components on the palm side and the fastening components on the handle side. And that is all we're going to do to break down this reel. And we don't need to go any further for routine maintenance. So now what we're going to do is simply clean all the parts, get all the old oil off, get all the old grease off, get any dirt and grime of foreign debris out of there, and then we'll reassemble. Now everybody's got their way of doing things. There's no right way to clean a reel. I typically use any type of Lysol or Clorox wipes. I've found that those work terrific for this, and it cleans the parts well and doesn't do any damage to them. It's always worked for me. If you have a different method, that's great. If you have a better method, feel free to leave a comment. I'm always open to suggestions. So now I'm simply going to go part by part, and I'm going to clean each component. I'm going to make sure that I pick them up and clean them and put them back down in the same order and position that I have them. Makes it much easier for reassembly that way. Okay, we just got done cleaning all the components of the reel, and the reel wasn't too dirty. You can see what I got out of it there on these two rags. And so we got all the old oil off, we got all the old grease off, and any pieces of debris that were in there. And so now we will begin to reassemble, and we will lubricate the reel as we go. So the first thing we are going to reassemble is the worm gear and the level wind guide assembly. I'm first going to take the worm gear tube, and remember that it only goes in one way. One end of it is lipped and has this ridge on the end that goes on the handle side of your reel. I'm going to go ahead and put that through the hole. And you'll recall that the level wind guide has a big hole for the worm gear tube and a smaller hole for the pillar. We're going to stick that through the big hole, and then we're going to seat the worm gear tube in the corresponding hole on the palm side of the reel. And that's just a matter of kind of finagling it in there, and you can hear it and feel it click into place so it's seated in there. So once you have that in place, we're going to go ahead and insert the worm gear in the worm gear tube, and then we are going to fasten the handle side and the palm side. So the worm gear goes in one way, and I'm going to make sure that the hole that the pin goes in for the gear on the handle side goes on the handle side. And we are going to fasten the handle side first, because the palm side must come second, because that's the side with that E-clip that holds it all together. So once we get that worm gear in the worm tube and we get it seated properly in there, the end with the hole is going to be sticking out. So we're going to take our bearing that goes on there, and that's going to tuck neatly into that lipped edge of the worm gear tube. I'm going to take my reel oil and put a drop of oil on that bearing prior to putting the plastic gear on. Now this plastic gear has grooves in it in which that pin fits, so you want to make sure those grooves are facing up so that pin can sit into them. So I'm going to put that gear on, and then we are going to take that small pin, and sometimes this can be difficult depending on how much dexterity you have with your fingers, and you may need to use a tweezer to get that little pin into the hole. And so I have it in, and now I just have to manipulate it so that it goes into the grooves on that gear. Okay, so now you will see the pin is in the hole on the worm gear, and it is seated down into the grooves on that gear. So while I fasten the other side, I'm going to make sure to keep holding this in place, otherwise it will fall out when I turn it over. So now we're going to move to the palm side of the worm gear, and you will recall that we have this plastic bushing, and the bushing has a rectangular protrusion on it, and it only fits in here one way. There's a little space for that rectangular section to fit, and that'll sit right down in there. And if it doesn't go in with your finger, you can just kind of sit it in there nicely with some tweezers. And so after the bushing goes the spacer, and now we're going to place the E-clip on there, which will hold it all together. Now this can be a little tricky, so you want to take your time with it. You want to get that E-clip into place, and then once you have it so it's ready to be popped on, what I like to do is take a slotted screwdriver and push it on with that. I find that to be easier, but I always make sure that I cup it with my hand, and you could hear me pop it on. And you want to cup it with your hand again so that thing doesn't go flying, because they're tough to find when they do. So now that we've secured the palm side of the worm gear with that E-clip, it's all being held together, so you don't have to worry about holding this side anymore. So now we have to put the pawl into the line guide, and the pawl has two small ears on the end of it. You can see those two ears, and that's the end that goes in, and those ears engage with the worm gear. And if it is sticking up above the hole that it's in, all you have to do is turn the gear, and it will fall into the grooves on the worm gear, and you want to make sure it's flush. And so now that it's in properly, I'm going to take that spacer and put that back on. And I can replace the nut. And I'm just going to hand tighten that nut. And so now we're going to replace the pillar rods, and I'm going to take the front one, which goes through the hole on the palm side and through the smaller hole on the level wind guide, through to the other side, and the nubbed end fits into the corresponding hole on the other side, and you just have to kind of manipulate that in there until you feel it seated in there. You do the same thing with the back rod, through the hole that it fits through and into the corresponding hole on the other side. And you want to make sure that is seated in that hole and not outside of it. And there we go. So now I have those rods in, and I'm going to hold it in this direction so they don't want to fall back out. If I were to tip this reel housing over, those rods would fall out. What holds those rods in is the hood. So we're going to replace the hood. And now that I have the hood held in place, you'll see that I'm able to tip this over and those rods don't fall out. So now that I have the hood there, I'm going to take the screws and secure the hood. With these small screws, I find it far easier to put the screw on the screwdriver and put the screws in the holes that way, because I just can't hold those tiny screws very well at all. Now you don't want to over tighten these screws on this hood because that's just plastic and you can break it. So now we have the worm guide and the level wind assembly put together again, and so now we are ready to move to the handle side components. So the first thing I'm going to do is put the main gear shaft and the gear and bearing plate assembly back in. Before I do that, I'm going to hit that bearing with some oil, and I'm going to go ahead, put that into place, line up the two holes for the two screws that hold that in place. And the gear shaft is now in place. And the next part we are going to do is reinstall the yoke and the pinion gear, and on this reel the pinion shaft. So I'm going to take the yoke and the pinion gear, and remember the fat side of the pinion gear goes in on the bottom. I'm going to attach it by sliding the middle of it in there, and then I'm going to drop the pinion gear into the hole while putting the two yoke posts through the two holes on the yoke, and that will sit nice and flush down in there. And then I will take the pinion shaft and place that in there. So now we're ready for the main gear assembly. First, the ratchet, and you'll see that the ratchet, the hole has that oblong rectangular shape, and that has to seat perfectly onto the bottom of the gear shaft. And you just have to make sure that fits in there properly and it's not misaligned. Carbon washer, main gear. Now when I put the main gear down, I may have to tip the pinion gear a little bit so it meshes with the main gear, like so. Now we're going to put in this carbon washer, drag washer, carbon washer, and the top drag washer. Now that we have the gears in place, I'm going to go ahead and grease those gears with real grease. And I'm not going to put a super lot on, but I'm just going to put a little coating of grease on the outside of the main gear. And then as that gear meshes with the pinion gear, it will distribute that grease throughout and keep your gears sufficiently greased. So now I'm ready to put the handle side plate on. But one very important thing, you don't want to forget to put the springs back on the yoke posts. And I have done that on several occasions before, and you end up having to take apart your reel to put those two springs back on those posts. Once those springs are on the post, you can replace the handle side plate. But before I do that, there's a bearing in there for the spool tensioner, and I'm just going to hit that with a drop of reel oil. And then I am going to put the handle side plate on. And you're just going to seat that in place where it fits nicely. And then we are going to go ahead and replace the screws in the same pattern that we took them out on. So this was the top left screw. Now I'm going to replace that lubrication port door with the final screw. And so that screw holds that lubrication door in place, but it also fastens the reel housing to the handle side plate. You don't want to over tighten that because that door is soft plastic. So now we are ready for the sleeve, and so we're going to make sure that the side with the oblong rectangular shape goes out and the circular opening goes down. And we're going to stick that right down inside. Then we're going to replace the click washer and click spring. And we're going to fit that over the threads and get that right down on there. And replace those two curved washers in the same orientation that we took them off and that we cleaned them in, so they're facing the correct direction. And then we're going to take this power washer, and now we are ready for the star drag. So once you get that star drag on the main gear shaft, you want to make sure you have that first thread seated properly. Sometimes it can be difficult to get that on that first thread, and you want to make sure there's no resistance when you spin it. You know you have it on correctly if it spins nice and easily like that. If there's any resistance, stop what you're doing, remove it, and start over again, because you don't want to strip that. So we're going to turn it once again, and since it's a lefty reel, it's going to be left to tight instead of right to tight. Now when it stops, I'm going to go ahead and hold the level wind guide in place because it's going to want to move, and that will allow me to tighten that down the rest of the way. Now we're going to replace the handle washer and the handle. Then we're going to replace the handle nut. I'm going to take my 10mm wrench and tighten it down, but not too much, just snug. And I'm going to put the handle nut retainer over the handle. What I'm going to do here, when I put the handle nut retainer on, is I'm going to put the hole close to it and then tighten it down to line up the holes so I can put the screw in. And you should only have to move that a little bit because you don't want to over tighten it. And once you have that hole lined up, you can insert the screw, and the screw should go right in with ease. If it doesn't, it's because that handle nut retainer isn't quite lined up with the hole, and you just have to tweak it a little bit to line it up a little better. So now we're done with the handle side, And we are going to replace the spool on the palm side. I'm going to drop of reel oil in there, as well as on this worm gear end, in addition to on the bearing on the spool. And then I'm going to insert the spool. And the last component is the palm side plate, which also has a bearing inside for the magnetic brake dial. And I'm going to hit that bearing with a drop of reel oil. Replace the palm side plate, click it into place to secure it. And there you have it, folks. One clean, quiet, and smooth reel. So I hope this video was a help to you if you own an Abu Garcia Revo SX reel. If you liked the video, hit that like button and hit that subscribe button. Help the channel grow. We're glad to be here for you. Thanks for being a part of Chicken Thigh Fishing, and we will see you next time. Stay fishing, my friends.